giving it all away now.
Sorry.
All right. Just a warning at the start, I suppose, to say that this is a pretty unambitious paper. It's not trying to explain anything, any kind of great shift in world politics or policy even. Nor is it theoretically original. It's more or less borrowing somebody else's theories, or derived from lots of other people's theories, and it's not doing. I haven't done any great empirical work for this, so there's no. There are only just 2 cases which I've looked at qualitatively. We've done some interviews with some of the actors involved in these cases, but don't expect too much. So hopefully expectations lowered, you'll think it turns out okay in the end. The paper is, as Darren explained, an attempt to explain why we have sometimes policy overinvestment in certain areas and not in other areas. So it conceptually uses this idea of bubbles, where we agree and we know that in, say, markets, that bubbles are when you have an overinvestment in a particular good that doesn't reflect the intrinsic value of the good. And obviously it's difficult to know exactly what the intrinsic value of the good is, because it's sort of sometimes the market that determines that. In policy terms, we can see that policymakers sometimes invest very heavily in certain types of policies. And sometimes we could argue that they overinvest, and that overinvestment in these types of policies yields bad results. So just like you seeing that house prices are going up, decide that you're going to buy a couple of apartments in Bulgaria that you've never seen, and then the whole thing goes belly up, and the apartments that you've never seen suddenly lose you lots of money, and you owe a lot to the banks. In policy terms, you can see that a policy, for instance, the idea of privatisation, which works and seems to be delivering some sort of benefits for politicians, either economic or electoral benefits, or both, more likely both, that they yield some returns, then you try and keep going and keep delivering the policies until such a time beyond the time that it is actually going to yield valuable returns for you. So you overinvest in a policy, and that ends up burning you in some way. And so what I want to do then is look at taxation policy and privatisation policy in Ireland, which arguably, here we have one example, taxation policy is one example where there was an overinvestment in the policy, or in income taxation policy, so personal income taxation. So we can see that in 1997, if you were earning about 40,000 euros in 2008 terms, you would have been paying 28.5% tax rate. You would have been paying 28.5% tax on that 40,000 euros. By 2008, that was down to 3.8%, was what you were paying on the 40,000 euros. I think that's a couple, but that's in constant terms. So we can see that there was, in the time from around 1987 to around 2007, a big drive to lower personal income taxation. And we can see that there was a time, for a long period of that time, that there were great returns. So as Ireland lowered its personal income taxation rate, the actual return to the exchequer was increasing. It was going up, the amount of money that it was getting back. Beyond around 2000, that ceased to be the case, and maybe just a little bit after 2000, it ceased to be the case. Yet we could see in the 2007 election, Irish politicians from the left and the right, so Pat Rabbitte, who was the leader of the Irish Labour Party at the time, was promising to reduce personal income tax by 2 more points. So we can see that bubble was that there was overinvestment in this policy. They were continuing to promise more income tax reductions, even though it was no longer yielding more revenue for the state, and probably at a time when the state wouldn't have even needed more revenue we're getting. We can contrast this to privatisation policy, where Ireland hasn't had very extensive use of privatisation. There have been a small number of industries that were privatised, but given that Ireland usually borrows its policies from the UK, so very often if you speak to senior civil servants in the past, they certainly admitted and accepted that whatever they had to do to look what they should do in response to a certain situation, their instinctive reaction was to look to the UK and then to, if it seemed to work reasonably well in the UK, to copy it. Now, given that the UK was the world leader in privatisation policy, and given that we were the main copycat of UK public policy, it's somewhat surprising then that we didn't overinvest in privatisation. There was a reasonably limited number of privatisations. Some of them were forced because they were non-profitable industries that had just been taken under control in previous decades to try and save jobs. But there were none of these major ones of the rail service. The transport services were very slow to be privatised. And generally, it was Irish governments were pretty slow to engage in privatisation. Okay.
Just click on the slide.
Sorry?
It's lost focus. Just click on the slide and the change. It's just
Oh, sorry.
just click.
Oh, sorry. So I won't go through the issues of the crisis in Ireland, but we can see that Ireland was shockingly, everything in Ireland improved. We had remarkably high growth. Unemployment went to practically zero. Gains everywhere, even life expectancy gains in the Irish life expectancy gains were the largest in the EU. So you could see that on any measure that you looked, Ireland was top of the range. Then we had the crisis, which, as the NESC points out, had kind of 5 parts to it. There's a kind of financial crisis, fiscal crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, reputational crisis. And the fiscal crisis was important. We can see here, just looking at various data on Ireland's performance, if you look at GDP growth, by 2009 it was in a worse state than Greece or Portugal. If you look at surplus, it was obviously for one extraordinary element. The deficit was extraordinarily bad in Ireland. So around 2009, things looked like they couldn't really get any worse. Unemployment, Ireland's unemployment in 2009, 2010, it was worse than Greece or Portugal. So it was pretty bad. So it went from being remarkably good to being remarkably bad in a very quick period. So what were the explanations for the crisis? What caused the crisis? So we can see that a lot of people would initially have said that there was it's not really a theory, but we could reference the idea of bad apples, that it was just a few bad mistakes in banks, and that then what happened was people started to herd. So there was herding among financial institutions. And so we can see that did happen. Anglo-Irish Bank expanded in the market. Some of the British banks that had come into the market put pressure on the sort of main two pillar Irish banks, and who eventually followed suit, and so they got involved in this risky lending, which accelerated the boom, but then made the bust much worse. We can see also that there was poor regulation or under-regulation of these financial institutions. We can see, and so these are the authors of 3 of the kind of significant reports that came out as a result. which one's which? That's Honohan. That's Regling. And that's Nyberg, is it? Nyberg. So they more or less looked at, but a lot of them, what these guys did was they looked at policy choices made by Irish policymakers, and they sort of zoned in on an idea that, one, there was a kind of a national speculative mania, but also that policymakers were extrapolating from previous performance to future expectations, and that they made poor policy choices on the basis of this extrapolation bias. There was also an issue that certain monetary policies, that instruments that had been available to the Irish were no longer available because we had the euro, and so no control over interest rates and things like that. So we can see here, Nyberg says it first, that's Nyberg obviously, that the widespread consensus, as well as the confidence until the very last moment in 2008 that everything would end relatively well, points to the existence of a national speculative mania. So a lot of the emphasis is on this idea of irrationality, cognitive biases among the policymakers and the financial institutions involved. And so that seems to be the main explanation that those three reports point to. They're obviously more nuanced than that. So what we have then is a research question: why do we see overinvestment in some policies but not in others? Now, one of the things that I think we can point to, there's an inevitable need for alliteration in these things, is that it isn't just some idea of irrationality, that the level of irrationality doesn't explain anything on its own. So we can say, oh, there was a national speculative mania, that policymakers were making poor choices. But it begs, or at least for me and my co-author, it begged to question is, what is causing these policymakers to make these poor choices? Why are they behaving irrationally or suboptimally or quasi-rationally, I think is the right phrase. And so one of the things some of the things that we need to look at, and these are some of the things that we can point from other literatures, primarily in looking at the US, but also in other countries, is the idea that institutions will be important to will have an impact on the optimality, how optimal the decisions that policymakers will take. Ideology will also be important, and interests will also be important. And we can then think of that these and how they might interact will then vary the level of rationality that we might see. Now, we might assume that kind of high levels of irrationality will then lead to suboptimal outcomes, whereas high levels of rationality will lead to optimal outcomes, but that would also possibly be false, because we can see that there are certain cases when people will, because of institutions' ideology and interests, behave perfectly rationally, as in cognitively go through and think through the likely outcomes of their decisions, but still make suboptimal decisions because, for instance, electoral politics gets in the way, interest groups get in the way, or ideology gets in the way. And so it could be perfectly rational for somebody to react to, say, ideology and to react rationally to ideology and yet still produce a suboptimal outcome. So you can see, for instance, in the US, the Tea Party, whatever it is called, it's not really a party, lobby group or campaign group, it would have put pressure on potential Republican candidates to sign up to a no new taxes clause. Now, you as a potential candidate might have said, that's nuts, I don't want to close off the possibility of introducing new taxes if a situation arises that we might need a new tax. But you could say, I know this is nuts, but rationally, if I don't sign this petition or whatever it is, this pledge, I will end up losing support of the Tea Party and I may not get elected. And so you can behave rationally and suboptimally as well. We can see how ideology would also lead us to behave irrationally. So an example might be, here you can think that somebody rational and an ideologue, a pragmatist and an ideologue, might agree that lowering taxes, so for instance what happened in Ireland, continuing to lower personal income taxes is a good idea. It yields benefits for the economy, so it might be associated with economic growth, it might be associated with increased returns to the exchequer, and there may not be any obvious downsides. We might then see, though, that continuing to invest in this process might stop yielding benefits. Now, in this case, the ideologue might keep on arguing for further investment, whereas the pragmatist would say, no, we're not going to invest any further in this. So the ideologue might just think that the tax cut is intrinsically inherently a good thing, whereas the pragmatist might kind of question each tax cut on its own merits. Equally, we can think about how institutions might have an impact on the level of rationality. So sometimes political institutions will bring certain types of information to the fore. And one of the reasons for so it's been argued in Ireland that one of the reasons that the Irish civil service didn't perform well was because it didn't have the requisite economic skills and things like that. That's been mentioned by a few people. It's possibly a bit unfair to the Irish civil service. It may be true that they didn't have those skills, but it is also true that in the US and in the UK, they obviously did have those skills. So they had some of the best brains in Britain and the US working in the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. And so those brains were there and thinking about it, but yet they were still producing the same advice. And that advice was that everything's going well, keep going, you've nothing to worry about here. And so, having spoken to one of the most senior civil servant, who was at one stage the most senior civil servant in the Treasury, he argued that one of their problems was that institutionally they had produced people and taken in people, all of whom agreed with each other. So everybody was had been trained in more or less the same way from more or less the same sorts of universities, and they more or less had the same opinions, and they had an institution that was very hierarchical, and it made it very difficult for other voices to be heard. So we can see that certain types of institutional frameworks will try and censor out certain types of information, and that might lead to irrationality because you don't get the information and you don't search for the information, and then leads to suboptimal decisions. Obviously, we went through ideological things and interest groups. So sometimes interest groups have a great deal of power. So we can see, particularly somewhere like the US, where money is important in an election, politicians need to respond to interest groups who very often supply that amount of money, and so politicians can respond rationally to these interest groups and say, okay, we're going to take on your policies because you're paying for them. We can also see that sometimes the power and strength of interest groups it'll interact with institutions, because sometimes the interest groups are given a place in the institutions, and in the Irish case that was true. We can also see that, and again this is the case in Ireland, that there are times when interest groups are the primary source of information. So very often the civil service or politicians will rely on interest groups for the information about certain types of policies. And this is, still the case in Ireland, but we can see even in better resourced organisations such as the European Commission, if you look at some of the kind of coverage of the Volkswagen scandal, on the emissions scandal with Volkswagen, we can see that still the European Commission, which is big and well resourced, relies to a very great extent for information from the actual interest groups, from those companies themselves. And so I don't think we can separate these out cleanly. And in fact, I don't think this is anything other than helping me to kind of talk through it, because I can't point to a time where this interacts with this will lead to this going up and this going down or anything like that. It will probably happen differently in every different case of a policy decision. That you'll have different types of institutions, you'll have different types of interests, you'll have different types of ideologies coming to the fore, which will then have some sort of impact. And remember, high levels of rationality aren't necessarily a good thing. They can also yield bad outcomes. But this is a very broad framework for looking at how things might work. So as I explained then, for taxation, there was this income tax, drop in income tax over 20 years. When the crisis eventually hit in Ireland, we did see that one of the problems that Ireland faced was that there was an insufficient amount of income tax coming in, that there had been an over-reliance on what are sometimes called fair weather taxes. And so this over-investment contributed, didn't directly cause, but probably contributed to the crisis. And it also contributed in other ways, in that it was a pro-cyclical investment, that you were kind of pumping more money into an economy that was already growing. Whereas privatisation, we see, as I explained, that there was a limited use and no over-investment. So why did this happen? Yeah, it's going to be too small for anybody to read, including me. So what we can see is that in Ireland, generally, there are a very small number of veto players there, that you have a Prime Minister and a government that can do more or less as it asks. Electoral institutions tend to give some amount of power to certain groups. Those groups would tend to be the most powerful groups tend to be geographically reasonably tight, and so you have a government that can do what it wants generally. It responds to electoral incentives, which tend to be local. In terms of the institutions and how the interest groups are represented in institutions, one of the more important factors in Ireland was this idea of social partnership. Many of you will know this, but I'll just, for those who don't, Ireland had a sort of, what's the phrase again? Not consociational policy, a corporatist policy. A corporatist means of representing trade unions and employers groups in budgetary policy. So we know that trade unions and employers groups more or less signed off on Irish budgets, or the kind of headline details of Irish budgets, before the Irish cabinet did. So one of the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, and the Minister for Finance would be aware of what was going on, but a lot of the other cabinet ministers around the table wouldn't know what was going to be in the budget until the morning of the budget, whereas the employers would have had spent a couple of months working on this sort of thing. So you have unions and employers who are very powerful, effectively veto players in the budgetary process. You have other groups in here, in the social partnership. So you have community groups and you have environmental groups that are also represented, but they all claim that they were ignored, and they were literally put in another room for where the kids got to play, while the big boys went into the room and actually worked out budget things. So environmental groups, even though they were nominally in this, and community groups nominally in this social partnership, they were actually put in an ante-room and so not really part of it. As part of the kind of research design here, one of the things that makes Ireland a useful and interesting case is that there tended not to be huge ideological competition. Even though we maybe sometimes say that some parties are kind of strongly left-wing and some parties are strongly right-wing, you tend to see, and you'll witness it in the current election campaign, is that there's a kind of very highly pragmatist attitude of the parties. Even the, what are they called, AAA, PBP, who are kind of Trotskyites, they are also against increasing the Irish corporate tax because they recognise that everybody thinks it's great, and so nobody can touch a totem such as that. So if you've even self-declared Trotskyites are in favour of low corporation tax, you can reasonably say that there is not a huge level of ideological competition, and certainly nothing like you could say existed in the UK in the 1980s, where you had a genuinely left-wing party vying for government and a genuinely right-wing party vying for government. In Ireland, they were shifting to the right, but in more pragmatic sense than in ideological sense. I think it's still the case that to call somebody in Ireland an ideologue would be an insult, whereas in the US, it might, Barry Goldwater might kind of say there's no shame in being an ideologue, and I'm sure a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz would not be ashamed of being labelled ideological, whereas in Ireland it isn't. And so we don't see, there's not much variation in that. The institutions, there's limited variation in these two areas, and in the interests, we probably think that there's limited enough variation as well. And so what we can see then is that, just go through, for taxation policy, we can see that over time there was as I pointed out at the very start, there was a reduction in the taxation rates, and we can also see that income tax as a percentage of the Irish revenue was continued to go down, and these kind of fair weather taxes continued to rise. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember what order these things are in. So, yeah, we can see some of these people in these reports kind of said that the Irish government's budgetary process was completely overwhelmed by social partnership. And what we can see is that Fianna Fáil government in 1987, that more or less continued in power until 2011, apart from a kind of two-year gap. One of the reasons for its electoral success is that it created this new coalition of interests between employers and employees and trade unions. That it was making ordinary workers well off, it was making employers well off, and they were all reasonably happy with this. And even though some would have wanted to challenge this model, they didn't really have any institutional mechanism by which to challenge it. All the parties were in favour of this. Anybody in social partnership was in favour of this, and then those who were opposed to some of these policies were literally sitting in the other room. Whereas for the privatisation, then we can see that we had tended to mimic the UK. We had a more or less similar institutional makeup, a very different ideological makeup. But we can see this is just a table of the privatizations. I'm not sure if it's going to mean anything, but except that all you can see is really there was only one big one. It was Telecom Éireann. And that happened. There were a number of attempts at other ones, and what we can, again, having spoken to ministers involved and spoken to some of the party officials involved and spoken to some of the people, the civil servants involved, we can see that there were attempts being made at the time to introduce further privatisation. So they wanted to do more of Aer Lingus, but they tended to be blocked at every stage. Telecom Éireann only really went through because the trade unions were given essentially, I don't know, blackmail is too strong a term, but they were kind of essentially given a huge amount of money, and the employees were given a vast amount of money through an employee share ownership, the employee share ownership trust. So lots of cash was yielded to them. Employees who had worked for Eircom became very, very wealthy. Where in the taxation policy, nobody was really objecting to it. Nobody who wanted to object to it had any way of stopping it. In privatisation policy, we see the institutional structures were more or less the same, but the interests of the groups were slightly different. Now, the trade unions claim now that they weren't in favour of the reduction in taxation, but that they just went along with it. But I mean, it was clear at the time that they were reasonably in favour of it, and the reduction in taxation was in lieu, essentially, of pay increases, and it gave their members effective pay increases. Whereas with privatisation policy, we spoke to them, and they were opposed to it, and they worked very hard to oppose these. And so in the Telecom Éireann becoming Eircom, in that case, they successfully intervened to try and stop it, and they were bought out through this employee share ownership trust. Where in other cases where there were attempts being made to privatise things such as, for instance, Dublin bus routes, there was an attempt to privatise Dublin bus routes. These were again objected to by the trade unions, and they successfully prevented things from happening. Went so far as to get the minister who was in charge of the portfolio moved from the department. And so, if we went through a number of the cases, and in all cases we could see that the trade union, through social partnership, successfully lobbied to block these attempts at privatisation. And they more or less got to that's not to say that they were wrong or that they were right, but we could see that even though there had been an attempt by some of the politicians in these governments to try more privatisations, they failed to do so. And so we can look at one specific example of the attempt to introduce a second terminal in Dublin Airport. So there is a second terminal there now. There was at the time an attempt to ensure that that terminal would be in private hands and not in the ownership of Aer Rianta. PDs who were in government at the time were lobbying hard for this. The minister who was in charge was in favour of that until he was removed, some say at the behest of the trade unions. And one of the problems for the PDs was that they no longer had any bargaining power. So politically, one of the things that had changed from, say, 1997 to 2002 was in 1997 to 2002, they were needed for the government to have a majority. So post-2002, the Progressive Democrats no longer had any power. So we can see that there was a change in the bargaining power of one of those parties. The unions effectively held on to a veto and extracted a high price, and ministers where we have on good authority, as in the ministers themselves told us that they were told by the Taoiseach when hired that they didn't want any more chat in the media from the unions, and just to keep things going. And so this is despite the fact that there is a similar institutional makeup and similar ideological makeup. And so what we then might see is that ideology wasn't necessarily important in these cases, but there was some evidence of irrationality. We can see some evidence that the Irish politicians were continuing to see that money was coming in and coming in and coming in, and they assumed that this was going to keep going on forever. And they were being told by their advisors that this was going to happen. What we can see is that we might also see that not having, so in the US cases, a lot of the academics studying this say that, having ideology involved in a policy-making decision is a bad thing because it leads people to behave irrationally. Whereas we can see here that, in fact, having no ideology might also be a bad thing because it stops different information from coming through. If everybody is ideologically on the same page, even if they're just kind of non-ideological, it doesn't lead to extra information coming out as a result of, say, that clash of ideologies. And so different points of view aren't important. So we can see that institutions then are important. The interaction of the interests and the institutional framework here. And so where we see that the trade unions have an interest to stop something, the institutional framework helped them do that and effectively allowed them to stop. So we can learn something from these two cases. One of the things I think we can learn is that possibly all the stars need to align for policy bubbles to be inflated, generally need to align for a policy bubble to be inflated. So you need the institutions and the ideology, perhaps, and the interests to be kind of working together. You can, of course, have a situation where the opposite is the case, where it might be that you have a policy that is already kind of set in train and it becomes impossible to stop it. And so in the US, where policy change is quite difficult, if the wrong policy is put in place, it makes it very difficult to stop a policy bubble from being inflated. Okay, thank you.